Did you know that depending on where you get your statistics from, up to 90% of all startups end up failing? But did you know why this statistic is so high? A large part of it is because people tend to build what they think people want, get funding for that, stay on time, and then when they actually launch, it's at that point that they learn that they actually build something that nobody wanted. And so in the book, The Lean Startup, Eric Ries tells us basically a framework for startups to test, learn, and adjust their strategy through a cycle of continuous improvement. And so that will help decrease that percentage, give you a much better chance at success. Now let's take a look at a few key takeaways here before we get too far into it. So entrepreneurship is a process that can be learned. Startups exist to build a sustainable business. So it's not strictly about developing a particular product, but building a sustainable business around a product or a service. Customers do not tell us what they want, at least not with their words. They actually reveal the truth through their action or their inaction. Now, your value and growth hypothesis are key to success and they need to be tested. A lot of people don't even know what a value or growth hypothesis is. And if you don't, that's okay. We're going to go through it as we get into this summary. And also utilize an MVP or a minimum viable product to cycle through this image here, the build, measure, learn feedback loop as quickly as possible. All right. So the book is divided into 3 sections: vision, steer, and accelerate. So we're going to begin here with vision. All right, the learning milestones. This is something that all startups have to focus on. All right, learning milestones and figuring out what you need to learn is key. And that's kind of what the build, measure, learn feedback loop is all about, is that a lot of people start with their product or their service and they just focus on that and they don't necessarily focus on learning. They create an elaborate business plan that they follow to the T, and it's at a later stage that they actually get the learning that tells them, hey, maybe there were some things you didn't do right along the way. And this process helps you actually focus on the things you need to learn. So the goal of a startup, again, is to discover the right thing to build as quickly as possible. And sometimes it means you can't start by building it and then finding out later. You need to get that validated learning as quickly as possible, which introduced the build, measure, learn feedback loop. So as you can see here, you have some ideas that leads you to build something. So you build a product, then you measure some information, you get data, then you learn from that data, which allows you to use that learning to create new ideas and build. What we'll learn later is that you actually start and you go backwards. You have to figure out what you want to learn first, figure out how to measure that, and then you build it. And what you're going to be building is called a minimum viable product. That's the least that you can build or the least that you can create in order to still gain the validated learning that is necessary. Now in this diagram here, we can see that vision is at the bottom. It's kind of the foundation. This is basically the true north for your business or for your company. This will not change, at least not very often. Now strategy is what you're going to use to achieve your vision. So this strategy can include a business model, a product roadmap, opinions about your competition, or even some assumptions about who your customers will be, things like that. That's your strategy. And then your product is the result of the strategy. The products can change constantly through this process of optimization. So your strategy will change sometimes, and we call that a pivot. That's what we have here. But your product might change constantly through a process of optimization. But you don't want to, and he cautions about this, you don't want to optimize something that someone doesn't want. That's all just a waste of time. So what is a startup? It is a human institution that is designed to create a new product or service under conditions of extreme uncertainty. And that part about the extreme uncertainty is kind of the key to what makes a startup unique. A business that's functioning, that has a clear business path, that millions of businesses already exist doing this thing, that's not really a startup because it's not extremely uncertain as to what you're building, how to build it, who wants it. If you're selling something that already exists, that other people already have existing business models for, then that's a little bit different. Not quite the same thing as a startup, not as the way Eric Ries defines it. Now, what is a product? This is any source of value for the people who become customers. So again, think of a product in terms of value, not in terms of a thing, not in terms of income to you, but you have to be providing value to the customer in order for it to be a beneficial product, both for you and for them. Again, we say customers do not tell us what they want. They reveal that truth through their action or through their inaction. And so we had to figure out how to get action out of them and not simply say, give a feedback, give a survey where you're asking, right? You're asking opinions. You're asking, hey, what would you do? But instead, this is about using tests and actual experiments to create an experience where you will get an action or an inaction from a customer. And that's where you actually gain validated learning. Any action that does not contribute to learning about what creates value for customers is a form of waste. So you have to validate a hypothesis. This is what leads to that learning. So you have to run an experiment. Don't ask, can this product be built? But rather, should this product be built? Again, can you even validate your hypothesis without building anything? You may be able to use simply like a landing page or a description or maybe a video or a demo of what your product would be or could be, and then get people to sign up or click on a buy now button or get on a waiting list. Or you haven't even built the thing, but you're getting that validated learning of if anyone is interested before you build it. And so then you can really skip a lot of the waste of preparing and building something that ends ultimately somebody doesn't even want. So that's the key part here. So validated learning, it says, if you cannot fail, you cannot learn. And this says, again, failure is success in progress. But that's kind of the point, is you can't learn something if you don't have a hypothesis that allows for failure to occur. One of the examples that he uses for this is the idea that if your goal in launching is to say, hey, we're going to launch and we're going to see what happens. He says, well, you're guaranteed to see what happens because you're going to see what happens. You might do well, you might do poor. But if there's no hypothesis that you're trying to measure against, then you will always succeed at seeing what happens. So you have to be able to fail to learn something. As an example here, Zappos was trying to validate their idea. So Zappos actually began by the person that was the founder. He had this idea of, hey, buying shoes online. But at the time, nobody knew if that was something that people would do. So he had to test this hypothesis. Would people even buy shoes online? So in order to do this, he actually went to a local shoe store. He asked them if he could take pictures of their shoes, put them on his website, and if somebody bought those shoes, he would go back to that store, purchase the shoes at full retail price from the store, and then ship them to his customers. Now, obviously, this is not a scalable model, right? But it's not supposed to be. He was validating an idea. And once he had the validation, enough people had bought through this process, he knew, okay, well, my hypothesis that people will buy shoes online has now been validated. Now I can move to the next phase, the next step, right? But he didn't begin by just buying a whole bunch of inventory and having warehouses and assuming people would buy shoes online, because then if that assumption turned out to be wrong, then he lost everything, right? So validate your assumptions, validate some hypotheses early on in the process, because if you're wrong, you're going to have to pivot sooner. And if you're wrong and you didn't pivot and you just continue down that road thinking you were right, then you're going to end up having a lot of wasted time and a lot of wasted money. So that's kind of the key on this one. All right, so early adopters, you want to begin by finding customers who feel the need for your product most acutely. What does that mean? That means basically you're trying to find people who already really want to support what you have to sell. And these are people that are going to be more forgiving of not a perfect product, right? Because they already need it. They already want it. And so if you find your early adopters, then your product doesn't need to be perfect. Now, once you find and scale from your early adopters, you'll eventually try to reach mainstream customers. They're going to have a higher standard for quality and everything else, but your early adopters don't. It doesn't have to be perfect right away. They'll accept your MVP because they see the value in what it is that you're offering, even though it might not be perfect. There's a quote here by Peter Drucker that says, "There's surely nothing quite so useless as doing with great efficiency what should not be done at all." So this goes again back to that validated learning. You want to make sure that you're learning that what you're working on, what you're building, is indeed something that somebody wants and would pay for. And if you find out that that's not true, then you can pivot early. And if you don't, once again, then you can spend your time optimizing and making something really good, making something really polished, only again to find out later that it doesn't matter. All that work was wasted because nobody wanted it. The two most important assumptions that entrepreneurs do make is your value hypothesis and your growth hypothesis. So the value hypothesis, again, is whether a product or service really delivers value to the customers once they are using it. And then the growth hypothesis is how new customers will discover a product or service. So if you're not sure how new customers are going to find you and purchase your product or your service, then That's the growth hypothesis. A lot of people that haven't really given much thought to it, honestly, and they just think like, well, if I just have a good product, then people will come, or maybe I'll do this, I'll advertise and people will come. And they don't necessarily have a huge criteria for their growth hypothesis. We get into a whole thing later on about engines of growth and kind of different strategies around that. So we'll get to that later on. So 4 questions in product development, and in this order, and this is again to try to limit waste, is do consumers recognize that they have the problem that you are trying to solve? And if they do have the problem, if there was a solution, would they buy it? And then more specifically, would they buy it from us? Or in your case, would they buy your solution to that problem? And then can we build a solution for that problem? All right. So those are the key things that you want to be looking at. If the answer to any of these kind of along the way is no, then that's kind of where you're going to cut it off, and you're going to stop pursuing that. So start with, do they even know they have the problem? Because you might be solving a problem that exists, but if the person you're trying to sell it to isn't aware of it, then you're not only trying to solve their problem, you're trying to convince them they have a problem. And you can do that, but like that's a lot more work than if it's a problem they're already aware of, right? All right, so then moving into the second section of the book, the steer section. All right, the products a startup builds are really experiments. The learning about how to build a sustainable business is the outcome of those experiments. All right, so if you're not running experiments, if you're not testing your hypothesis, then you're not really getting that validated learning. You're not really growing your business. You might just still be trying to push something that people don't really want. And you're trying to figure out optimization ways of including extra features, building something more. Maybe if I, change something on my website, but ultimately the failure is the fact that people don't want the product that you're trying to sell. There might be a small group that does, and that was maybe who you got that feedback from initially, but there's not a broad enough audience or market for that product. So the goal here is to minimize the total time through the build, measure, learn feedback loop. All right. You want to build something, measure, get the data that you need to learn. And then you're going to, at this point of learning, decide whether you're going to pivot or persevere. So the Facebook case study here is that more than half of the users that Facebook had came back to the site every single day. So this is how a company can validate the hypothesis, the value hypothesis, that the customers find value in the product because they're coming back. They're using it again and again. So clearly you're providing value, or they wouldn't be coming back. For any early startup, your goal is to test your assumptions as quickly as possible. Am I actually providing value? Am I actually, is there actually a method or a process for gaining growth and traction with my current strategy? All right, and then you're going to have to adapt your strategies accordingly in order to actually achieve success. Many entrepreneurs are actually in the right place at the right time, but they still ended up failing. And then what was the difference between the successful ones and the ones that didn't succeed? I mean, if you think of like Henry Ford creating a car, right? He wasn't the only person working on this project, but part of what allows successful entrepreneurs to reach that success is their ability to be agile, to be able to pivot in order to learn something and save the parts of the business that are successful and scrap the parts that they find aren't. So they have to be testing and constantly learning through this process. And the ones that learn quicker than competitors are successful, and the ones that learn slower or not at all are the ones that don't turn out to be successful. In order to start this test and do this work, you have to have a minimum viable product. This starts that process of learning. Now, again, they aren't meant to be perfect, and for your early adopters, they don't have to be. All right, adding extra features beyond what the early adopters demand is a form of wasted resources and time. Now, this could be a lot of waste, a lot of time. You might spend 6 months developing something, a year developing something that you only later find out nobody wanted. You might spend $5,000, $10,000, $100,000. The amount of wasted energy, time, effort, and money ultimately depends on what you were trying to build. But the idea is that all of it ends up being waste if it's something that your early adopters didn't need, so that you could validate whether or not people wanted it. All right, complexity depends on the idea and the industry, and it could be as simple as an ad or a landing page, or it could be as complex as a working prototype. And it really just depends on what assumptions that are needing to be tested. All right. And so that's something that only you can determine for your industry, for your business, but you want to figure out what's the minimum that I can create that still gets the job across to my early adopters that they can then use and actually provides them that value. If we do not know who the customer is, then we do not know what quality is, because that's going to depend on the customer and what they consider quality. So part of this process is knowing your customer in order to know what to build. And that's those early adopters. If you know who your early adopters are, then you can build something specifically for them. All right. And then the customer archetype describes the target customer. It guides the product development, and it allows making decisions based on whom you aim to appeal. So once again, if you're aiming for a customer segment in one area versus another, the way that you market to a student versus a teacher, maybe the way that you market something to a parent of a student to a student, who are you targeting? When you're marketing to kids, right? There's marketing that's aimed at kids, but there's marketing that's aimed at parents of kids. And how you structure those messages is going to be different. So you have to know, who is my target audience? Who am I trying to reach? Who is my target customer? And then that informs a lot of these decisions. So you do have to do the work to figure out who your customer is. Now, building the MVP. You have to remove any features, any process or effort that does not contribute directly to the learning that you seek. One example that he uses, he has a company, Eric Ries, and they basically were building software. And in this process of building software, they had a whole bunch of different features. And the point is that along the process of building something that has 15 features, you probably ended up coming across a version of the software that was functional with 3 features. Well, if those 3 features were sufficient for the early adopters to be happy and run with it, then you never needed to build the rest of them. Because the 3-feature version of the product you could have released, and early adopters would be like, this is awesome. All right. And this goes back to, you can go even further back and scale it back to, again, just a landing page that describes what the product is, which says, like, again, a wait list, or give us your email, or again, just a buy now button, and you check the analytics. And if 10% of the people that come to that web page are clicking the buy now button, then you validate, like, oh, this is something that people are interested in. It's something people will buy. So then you can build it. You've validated the learning there. So your MVP can be kind of as big or as small as it needs to be. Just depends on what you're trying to do. So again, there are different types of MVPs. There's the video MVP, which explains the concept and asks people to sign up just through a video. There's not an actual product. Then there's the concierge MVP, where you're going to do everything yourself to create an awesome personalized experience for somebody. But again, the caution here is that it's not necessarily very scalable. And it's possible that if you run this kind of concierge MVP, you might actually gain traction in this process and do well. You might actually make decent money. But if you continue to operate in this concierge way, then you're leaving money on the table beyond being able to scale. So you might have to shift your process of delivering that value in a way if you want to be able to scale. But you might be able to really serve a small audience well. And that's good. But again, you want to be able to move past that. All right. And then the final one is the Wizard of Oz MVP. This is where you simulate the technology that you would need to develop by doing it yourself behind the scenes while you test your assumptions. In some ways, you could argue that the Wizard of Oz MVP was sometimes the Zappos example, because he didn't actually have a functioning, back office where you order it and it ships directly from Zappos. So he was kind of doing the work behind the scenes. And then, eventually he was able to have his own warehouse and stuff where you were buying it directly from Zappos, and they had manufacturing, all that sort of stuff. That's all different. But initially, that wasn't really what was happening. But people thought I was still just buying shoes online from Zappos and getting it. So it's that kind of stuff, behind the scenes work, where it looks like something's happening, but it's really not happening. And you can even example the Wizard of Oz stuff. Also, I think applies to things like Apple when they're doing like their iPhone rollout the first time. Those kinds of things, like the product itself on the stage that might be pushing buttons. That particular device may or may not actually be working, but the stuff on the screen kind of makes it look like it's working, and it's kind of this production. So everything looks like and appears as though everything's working great, but in reality, it's still just maybe a prototype, just an example, right? So different versions there of what an MVP could look like for you. Now, the other thing that you have to be paying attention to in this build, measure, learn feedback loop is, are you actually making your product better? And how do you know? A good design is one that changes customers' behavior for the better. So you need a clear baseline metric, a hypothesis about what will improve that metric, and a set of experiments designed to test that hypothesis. So here we have the option to use split test experiments. This is where you can quickly identify what features matter to customers and which do not. Split testing is, again, where you can have different versions of a product that are offered to customers at the same time. Now, when you're talking about metrics, here are the 3 A's of metrics that Eric talks about in the book. They have to be actionable, accessible, and auditable. So again, we have to have a clear cause and effect. This is the actionable part. A clear cause and effect between the experiment and the metrics. They have to be something that can be acted upon. Accessible means that they need to be simple enough, as simple as possible, so that everybody that needs to know can understand them. They can't be too complicated for the group, for your team to understand that's all working on it. And auditable, they must be able to test the data by hand. All right, so those are the 3 A's of the metrics. Now, what is the point of all this? Why are you gathering all these metrics? Why are you doing all these tests? What are you trying to accomplish? Ultimately, all of this stuff and going through the build, measure, learn feedback loop is all about pivoting or persevering. All of this stuff is driving you to this point. All right, a pivot is best understood as a new strategic hypothesis that will require a new MVP to test. All right, so let's say that one more time. A pivot is best understood as a new strategic hypothesis that will require a new MVP to test. So you went through the build, measure, learn feedback loop. You went through, you tested your stuff, you gained your data. Now you have your data. Your data tells you what you originally thought was true is not. So now you have to say, okay, well, if that was not true, we need to pivot, we need to change, we need to go a different direction. But now with this new direction, we have new hypotheses, new things that we're not really sure about. We're just kind of saying, well, kind of need to go this direction. So now you have to create a different MVP because you need to learn if this is a value, something that your customers will find value in, etc. So then you need to build something else so that you can test this to learn again. So that's why the whole point of this is to get through the build, measure, learn feedback loop as quickly as possible so that you can get the learning that you need, because eventually you're going to find stuff that's like, oh, persevere, this is good, this is solid. But then you're going to test again another maybe feature, something like that, and you're going to go like, oh, they didn't like that feature, but they did like this. We need to double down on what's working, cut back on what's not. And that's this constant continuous improvement life cycle that exists. All right, so here's just a rundown of different types of pivots. So there's the zoom in example, which is a single feature of a current product. Maybe that becomes the whole product, kind of zoom in on a specific aspect. The zoom out is what was considered to be the entire product becomes just a feature of something even bigger. And so it's the opposite. Now, the customer segment pivot, this is, again, where problems are solved. You do have a real solution, and it's a real solution for real customers, but it might be not the customers you had originally thought. So that's where you're going to need to go the other direction with that. And then the customer needs, maybe the problems that you were trying to solve aren't actually that important to the current customer base, but you've discovered more important problems that exist along the way. And so now you're going to go deeper down that road in that direction with this bigger problem. So it's the same customer group, but a different problem. Maybe you're going to change platforms, so changing from an application to a platform or vice versa. Maybe it's the architecture of your business, maybe B2B, business to business versus B2C, business to customer. You might switch that between the two of those. And maybe the value capture is going to be your pivot. It's how you decide to make money. Maybe you're going to go from let's say you have a coaching business and it's one-on-one, or a consulting business one-on-one, and maybe you're going to shift that to something digital or passive, or maybe you're going to do cohort teaching, maybe classroom type of things, or whatever. Maybe you sell a product, but you also want to get into, an online presence where you can get money from advertisers and things like that. So the way you make money can shift. Or then there's an engine of growth change. So a change in the strategy. So maybe you can seek faster, more profitable growth. A change in the channel or pivot, so that you change your distribution channel or technology. You can achieve the same solution, but with a different technology. So maybe that's a worthwhile pivot. So all this stuff is kind of dependent on your business and what you're trying to accomplish. All right, now moving into section 3, this is the accelerate section. So what does a startup need to accelerate? A startup is going to need organizational structures to combat the extreme uncertainty. The extreme uncertainty is the chief enemy of a startup. So you have to have systems in place and structures in place that are going to fight against that. The value in a startup is not the creation of stuff, but rather the validated learning about how to build a sustainable business. So these structures are what contribute to that. Now, here are some questions to consider along this way. What products do customers really want? And how will our business grow? Who is our customer? And which customers should we listen to and which should we ignore? Now that last one can be, pretty important, because if you find yourself listening to the wrong customers, you're going to make changes that might actually hurt your business instead of help your business. So you want to work on continuous development. That's releasing small new features all the time. And that's testing those new features to figure out whether or not they actually improve things for customers. And then you want to learn faster from your customers. So again, you want to get that validated learning, You want to be able to learn more than your competitors, faster than your competitors. It is not the customer, but our hypothesis about the customer that pulls work from product development and other functions. So it's how well you know your customer, right? If you know your customer really well, then your hypothesis about the customer are going to be correct more often. And if you don't know your customer very well and you're making hypotheses, you're going to find out that they're wrong more often. But finding out whether your hypotheses are right or wrong is not a problem if you're using this testing method and gaining that learning. It's only a problem if you aren't testing your assumptions and you're just assuming you're correct all the time. So that's the thing that they kind of go over. Now, growth is something, again, in the terms of the acceleration portion, he has things that he calls the engine of growth, and he has things that are called sustainable growth. Now, the engine of growth is the mechanism that startups use to achieve sustainable growth. And he says sustainable growth is when new customers come from the actions of past customers. So a startup can evaluate whether it's getting closer to product market fit by measuring the direction and degree of this progress. All right. So there are 4 primary ways that past customers drive sustainable growth. All right. And we have number 1 is word of mouth. All right, that's pretty straightforward. When people like something, they might share it with other people as a side effect of product usage. So this might be if you see somebody like somebody that bought a brand new car, right? Well, then when they drive their car, other people are going to see that they're driving their car, and that might, impact their usage. So that's a side effect of that you using the product, you buying that car. Naturally, other people are going to see that, and that's going to do that. Now, through funded advertising, obviously that means you're spending money to buy advertising space to get your ad in front of other people. They're going to see that ad, and then ideally they're going to convert and want to buy something from your product, or through repeat purchases or use. Some things are subscription-based type of models, so people come back and they continue to buy something over and over. And so that's another version of that past experience. So your 3 engines of growth, if you're trying to grow, is you have the sticky engine, the viral engine, and the paid engine. Now, the sticky engine says that if the rate of a new customer acquisition exceeds the churn rate, then the product will grow. All right. So the churn rate is basically how often people leave. So if you think about having like a subscription like Netflix, then if they get 1,000 people to sign up in the next hour and 100 people left, then that 100 people that left was the churn rate. 100 people did quit at the same time that 1,000 people gained. So if they're gaining more customers faster, the growth rate is faster than the churn rate, then that's how they're going to be successful in that example. Now, the viral engine is kind of a feedback loop that's determined by what's called the viral coefficient. So how many new customers are going to be the product or consequence of each new customer who signs up. So if the viral coefficient is greater than 1, then that means that for each new person who signs up, they're going to bring on average 1 more person with them. So again, if you think about like Facebook, well, when 1 new person used Facebook and they talked to other people about it, then they got their friends to sign up. So when that 1 person joined, that person had at least 1 or 2 or 3 of their friends join. And then when those 3 people joined, then they had 1, 2, or 3 of their friends join. So it kind of grew virally. That was the goal, that viral coefficient. Now, if that viral coefficient is less than 1, it doesn't work. Finally, we have the paid engine. And again, this is where a portion of your revenue is spent on advertising. And then you have to take things like cost per acquisition and even customer lifetime value, and those kinds of numbers become more important. Now, again, adaptation is very important. Most mistakes are caused by flawed systems, not necessarily by bad people. All right, so training is important to focus on for incremental improvements because, again, you're training people. And so if you have a system where something failed and it can be attributed back to a person, well, if you can provide training to those people to avoid those mistakes, then you've created a system. It's not that the person was the problem. It was that maybe they weren't trained on how to do something properly. So yes, they made the mistake, but it was the system of not having adequate training that led to that mistake, right? So training is important in this process of being able to adapt. So you want to be building an adaptive organization, one that automatically adjusts its processes and performance to its current conditions. And so if you're able to do that, then you can continue to adapt over time and continue to seek success, even when there's a roadblock right in front of you, because you have the ability to change. So that's what the 5 whys are. And this is something Eric Ries talks about in the book. He says, use it when new problems come up to discover the root cause. And he says, again, at the root of every seemingly technical problem is a human problem. The example he uses in the book is like if there's a machine that's not working, they say, well, what was wrong? Well, a fuse got blown. Well, why did the fuse get blown? Oh, because it was overloaded by this thing. Well, why was it overloaded by that thing? Oh, because somebody didn't, properly lube this part of the machine. Well, why didn't somebody properly lube that part of the machine? Oh, well, they weren't trained to do that. And they said, oh, then there we are. So the issue we had here was that a person wasn't properly trained on how to maintain the machine. And that's what led to the ultimate problem with the machine breaking down. But if you stopped at the first question, hey, why is the machine not working? Oh, the fuse blew. Then they say, okay, well, then we need to just buy a new fuse. But if they just bought a new fuse, that new fuse would ultimately break later on too, and they would just have to keep replacing the fuse, when in reality, if they actually trained the person who was in charge of maintaining the machine properly, then the fuse wasn't really the problem, right? The fuse was fine, but it got overloaded because of all these other tiers. So you get to the human error side of things by asking why, in this case, 5 times. You can kind of ask it more or less, so just however many times you really need to ask it to get to that human factor error and what you can now fix, what you can address about that. And so again, the whys provide an opportunity to discover what the human problem might be. And then once you discover the problem, you have the opportunity to fix it. And the next part here is innovate. So goals of your team is to work cross-functionally to achieve validated learning. If what your teams are working on is, going a bunch of different directions and focusing on different things and not necessarily focus on that validated learning, then that falls into that form of waste that he talks about all throughout the book. There are 3 structural attributes that startups need, and these are some of those organizational structures that are going to combat that extreme uncertainty that exists. And so here we have, they need to have scarce resources, but secure resources. Now, why does that matter? Well, if you think about a startup, the fact that a startup might actually lose funding at any point would totally derail any progress that they've been making, because they're assuming they have some amount of funding to work, right? So you don't necessarily want to give a startup too much money, because then they are prone to waste because they have more than they may need. And they can't have not enough funding or resources, because then they can't accomplish setting up the tests that they need to gain the validated learning. So it's kind of that happy medium, but it needs to be secure. It can't just be wiped out from under them because, if they work within a larger company and a VP is kind of like, nah, I don't like that project anymore, we're going to pull that. Obviously, that's going to be devastating. Next, they need to have independent authority to develop their business, develop their ideas without necessarily having too much oversight and having too many processes that they need approval for. Once again, if you work with a startup where the startup is kind of within, the innovation is having within a larger company, then its point is to say if there's too many approvals and signatures that need to happen for work to happen within the progress, then you can't work fast enough to gain that validated learning, to go through the build, measure, learn, feedback loop. If every step and everything you're trying to get approval and has to wait a day or you have to wait a week, then everything just gets slowed down. You can't learn quickly enough to actually be successful. So you don't want to have too many things in their way as far as that goes. And then a personal stake in the outcome. Now, this personal stake in the outcome, again, does not have to be monetary. Obviously, like if you're a startup and that's the whole company, then the monetary success of the startup is tied to, individual people's income and that sort of thing. But even if you work, again, as an employee of a larger company, just having your name attached to the project now provides that accountability, if you will. So that if the product succeeds, then you're attached to that. If it fails, you're attached to that. And sometimes that has more of a motivating factor, or as much of a motivating factor as the monetary stake that you may have. All right. So waste comes not from the inefficient organization of work, but rather from working on the wrong things. And that's what this whole framework in Eric Ries's book, The Lean Startup, is trying to address. It's that inefficiencies, that not that you're being inefficient in your organization of work, but that you're spending a ton of time, and you might be working very efficiently, but building the wrong thing, something that people don't want. And that's the quote here, once again, by Peter Drucker: "There is surely nothing quite so useless as doing with great efficiency what should not be done at all." So again, if you're building a product that nobody wants, then it doesn't matter how efficiently you're doing it. And Eric Ries in the book says it doesn't matter if you're getting it done on time and on budget. If you're building something nobody wants, it doesn't matter. All right, so that's kind of the key here. So I hope you enjoyed this review, this summary of Eric Ries's book, The Lean Startup. But go ahead and like and subscribe for more content like this, talking about business, talking about startups, especially if you have a lifestyle business. We want to help you solve those problems. So continue to check us out. And if you want to watch more content and continue learning right now, then definitely check out this video next. And we will see you in the next one.